Get started again. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Buenas tardes, and welcome to Voces de primavera, or Voices of Spring. It's a bilingual poetry reading and conversation with Sarah Pollack. And Sarah, I always called you Sarah, so now you're Sarah, even though you're in English, it's Sarah.
Wonderful.
So we're glad you could join us this evening. I'm Novia Pagone, Assistant Professor of Spanish and Global Studies, and I'm here with my co-organizer, Jelena Radovic-Fanta, who's an Associate Professor in the Anthropology and Sociology program. We're excited to welcome Sarah Pollack to our virtual campus. This is an annual event that we do, and tonight our conversation will focus on the art of translation. But before I introduce Sarah formally, I have a few acknowledgements and housekeeping items. This event is part of the Making Spanish and Global Studies Accessible to All project, which Jelena and I co-direct. The aim of the project is to create opportunities for students from across our campus community to access events, resources, courses, and study abroad related to Spanish and global studies. The project is made possible by the Department of Education's Undergraduate International Studies and Foreign Language Grant. And we would also like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for their support of today's event. So a few housekeeping items. I know all of you have been to these Zoom, or experts now at coming to Zoom events, but we ask you to keep your microphones muted during the presentation. We'll have a conversation and some poetry reading, and then once we start the Q&A, you'll be able to unmute your microphone if you'd like to ask a question. You can always put questions in the chat or comments as the event progresses. Okay, so I'd like to introduce, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sarah Pollack. She's an Associate Professor of Latin American Literature and Translation Studies at the College of Staten Island and the Graduate Center of City University of New York, CUNY. Her research focuses on contemporary Latin American literature and translation studies. She has published many literary translations from Spanish to English of authors including Juan Villoro, Fabio Morábito, Enrique Fierro, Cristina, Peri, Rossi, and Oswaldo Estrada, who was one of our guests for this event about a year ago, right? And these have been published in journals such as Words Without Borders, BOMB, Gulf Coast, the Brooklyn Rails, InTranslation, Reunion, the Dallas Review, and International Poetry Review. She has published translations of the collections of poetry Reason Enough, 2007, published by Host Publications, by Uruguayan poet Ida Vitale, Eloise from Unicorn Press in 2015 by Mexican Silvia Eugenia Castillero, as well as the novellas Passages from Chatos Inhumanos 2018 by Argentine Mariana Graciano, and an evocation of Matthias Stimmberg from Wakefield Press in 2021 by Mexican author Alain-Paul, does he say Mallard?
Mallard, it's French.
Mallard, okay, Mallard, all right. Wasn't sure if it was the French pronunciation or the Spanish. And Sarah is currently working on translating an anthology of poetry by Ida Vitale, and we will be hearing some of the poems from that collection this evening. So welcome, Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Novia, Jelena. I wanted to thank Governor State University for this wonderful invitation, and for all of you for being here tonight. We're maybe a small cohort, but all here for poetry, for translation, and I'm really excited to take a break from kind of daily life to do this reading and have this conversation with you. So thank you. It's really a delight to be here with you today.
Yeah, thanks. We're excited. So I'd like to start with a couple of poems. Like I said, you've shared with us some of the poems from the new anthology. It's over 150 poems, right, that you're translating. Seems like a huge project. So I would like to,
yeah, it's a new project for a press called New Directions. That's a really well-known press that's done a lot of work in translation of Latin American poets and also excellent writers in English. And they asked for a new anthology of translations kind of spanning Ida's almost 80 years of writing. And so I turned it in last week, actually. And now the question is kind of sorting out which ones get to stay in, which ones probably will be used for other projects. But we are at that exciting stage of now editing the volume.
Yeah, wonderful. So I wanted to start with two of those poems, and we have them in English and in Spanish. The first one I thought we could start with is the first one in the group that you gave me, which is Vegetate, or in Spanish, Vegetar. And maybe we could start, Sarah, with the English, if you would like to read that. And then we have one of our students from my Spanish class, Maddie, is here, and she was going to read the Spanish for us. So would you like to start with the English, and then we'll go into the Spanish?
Yes, and thank you, Maddie, for volunteering. This is from a very recent collection that was published just a couple months ago. It's called Tiempo sin Claves from 2021. And the book begins with a series of poems in prose, which is a little bit unusual for this author. So this is Vegetate, and I will be reading the English. Can vegetating be so bad? Must you take root with the permanence that implies? Perhaps a little sand would suffice, but then it would be a cactus that achieves a new state. Doubtless, it would be better to seek some black earth for the experience, as not just any soil is apt for the adventure that begins. Are a few sprouts enough? But no matter how much you will it, they'll emerge nowhere without a minimal root. And for that, you need stillness. Sinking and stillness.
Thank you. So now I want to invite Maddie, if you want to unmute yourself and read the Spanish of this poem.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Vegetar. ¿Será tan malo vegetar? ¿Habrá que echar raíces con la permanencia que eso implica? Quizás baste un poco de arena, pero entonces será un cacto lo que venga a nuevo estado. Sin duda será mejor buscar para la experiencia un poco de buena tierra negra, porque tampoco cualquier tierra se presta para la aventura que comienza. Serán suficientes unos brotes, pero por más que uno se ponga voluntarista, aquellos no van a aparecer por ningún lado si no logra una mínima raíz. Y para esto se necesita quietud, hundimiento y quietud.
Yay. Thank you so much, Maddie. I love that poem because it kind of reminds me of, yes, applause, kind of reminds me of what's happening right now, right? And so it's, I think, appropriate that it's one of the more recent pieces. So before we get into more discussion, I wanted to ask Jelena and you, Sarah, to read Mi Homenaje.
Okay, so I guess I'll start with the English version, My Tribute. My tribute to the one who planted every tree without thinking forever. Or perhaps imagining someone removed who will one day invoke it in celebration. To that which, despite midday, comes to pass in the glory of sunset. To everything that happens without being more than that, something. To the bus driver, courteous, smiling, who uplifts an afternoon with his simple greeting. To the bird that sings, to whomever in a dilapidated country dares to voice a risky opinion. To the one in the valley who remembers there are mountains and in one drop of water, forgetting the fog, trembles before drought and the desert it extends. To the bench whose damp wood welcomes and refreshes me until the punishing summer lets up. To the void that seeks to brim over despite the vertigo, and to bagpipes hailing solitude from the cliff's edge. To the one who remembers me, to the one who forgets.
Thank you. Jelena.
Mi homenaje. Mi homenaje al que plantó cada árbol sin pensar, para siempre. O acaso imaginando el desunido que un día lo convoca, lo celebra. A lo que no obstante el mediodía se da en glorioso atardecer. a todo lo que ocurre sin ser más que eso, algo. Al conductor del ómnibus, cumplido, sonriente, que levanta una tarde con su simple saludo, al pájaro que pía, a quien en su país desvencijado ose decir su parecer riesgoso, al que en el valle recuerda que hay montañas y en una gota de agua, olvidando la niebla, tiembla ante la sequía y el desierto ofrecido, al banco cuya húmeda madera me acoge y me refresca, mientras el tormentoso verano no da tregua, al hueco que busca colmarse pese al vértigo, y a la gaita que llama a soledades desde un acantilado, al que se acuerda de mí, al que me olvida.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful poem. So again, before we get into the talking more about the poetry, Sarah, I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about Ida Vitale and your connection to her and her work, and sort of how you got started translating her work.
Okay. It's kind of a long answer, but I guess I'll start by parts. So I first learned of Ida, which is embarrassing, as a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, through her husband, Enrique Fierro, who was my dissertation advisor. And I say it's a little embarrassing because she truly is one of the greatest living poets, and I would say 21st century and 20th century poets that have written in Spanish. And I, unfortunately, in my master's and undergraduate, did not read her before. And so I met her through this personal connection with her husband, Enrique Fierro, and quickly discovered that she was truly a marvel. Her name is Ida Vitale, and Vitale, her last name, has the word vital in it, and it truly represents who she is. I don't know somebody more aptly named. So she's now 90, almost 99. She's 98, and she is this just source of energy, of intelligence, of brilliance on all levels. She moves quickly, her physical body, her mental acuity, it's just, she's this remarkable human being. And so through my relationship as a student with her husband, Enrique, and then friendship that developed, Enrique was my dissertation advisor, I got to know his wife and her poetry and was blown away. And so I'd like to just kind of start with a little bit of background about who she is as a writer and why I think she's so remarkable. But she was born in 1923 in Montevideo, Uruguay. And she's a poet, an essayist, a translator, a literary critic, and a professor. And her family, like so many people in the Cono Sur, was originally from Italy. Her family hailed from Sicily. And she was fourth generation of Uruguay, but with strong connections still to her Italian heritage. And her family was middle class, upper middle class, cosmopolitan, fairly well educated. They had a large library at home. And she was just a brilliant child, interested in music and literature. And this is, she's growing up in the 30s, in the 20s and 30s. And so expectations for women are changing, opportunities for education are changing, but she was encouraged to study, and she read voraciously young. She famously says that her first novel was War and Peace, which she shouldn't have read, but it was right in the room where she was supposed to dust the bookshelves. And so she grabbed that and read it. She said she didn't understand anything, but she slowly discovered poetry. And this is a time when some of the very first women poets are being recognized in Latin America. So she first discovered poetry because she was asked in school to read the Chilean Nobel laureate Gabriela Mistral. And Uruguay at that time really had this most remarkable, I've always been so jealous, a public education system that was in the process of changing at that moment. And so students from a very young age had access to really high quality public education. And the high school level, if I compare that to what I did in my public high school, nada que ver, really completely world-class education. So there were very famous literary critics and authors and musicians and philosophers who were teaching at the high school level. And so she benefited from that experience of getting truly a world-class education in high school. And at that time, the Universidad de la República, which is the main university in Uruguay, was beginning also to change. And so there didn't used to be a humanities track, but when she was basically of age, and there was the closest thing that a lot of people who were interested in literature studied was law. And so she started out studying law because that's politics and reading and understanding the social. And at that time, they actually were opening up a humanities track, a Facultad de Humanidades. So she began to actually take university classes, again, with really extraordinary teachers. But she actually didn't end up finishing her degree. She said that she ended up preferring to do her own reading and her own path making outside of the strictures kind of the university. But she was incredibly active in the literary life of her time. And her first husband, a very famous literary critic named Ángel Rama, and she were part of what has been called La Generación de 1945, the generation of 1945. And the people kind of included in this grouping of people, there are authors like Mario Benedetti, a very famous poet, Amanda Berenguer, another poet named Ida Vitale. There was this kind of boom of really brilliant writers. And she, and along with a lot of these other poets, began creating these literary projects. So writing new newspapers, literary supplements, translations, really opening up Uruguay to the rest of the world through translation, through all this publication. And that's when she began writing her own poetry, which didn't receive a whole lot of critical attention, although it was highly respected. So there's a Nobel poet laureate from Spain, Juan Ramón Jiménez, and he was stopping through Uruguay at the time, read some of her work, and was blown away by it, and included, even though she was very young and hadn't published much, he was creating an anthology called Presentación de la Poesía Hispanoamericana Joven, and she was only one of 2 Uruguayan women included in it. So she began to get a lot of recognition among her peers, but not so much beyond Uruguay. And she continued doing a lot of different projects, also teaching in high school, publishing small volumes of poetry. And she was personally sympathetic to kind of socialism, but never really declared in her poetry her political aspirations or associations. But she and her second husband, who is Enrique Fierro, were kind of implicated in a dissident group that was not in favor of the 1973 coup d'etat, which changed the government, put in this military dictatorship. And so she and her husband had to flee Uruguay, and fortunately they were given an opening to move to Mexico City, and they were there for over 10 years. And in Mexico, she began working with another Nobel laureate, Octavio Paz, who invited her to join kind of his poetic circle, which is called Vuelta, his literary magazine. She helped found a newspaper in Mexico, Uno Más Uno. She taught classes at the University del Colegio de Mexico, and she began publishing a lot more. And when the military dictatorship fell in 1984, she and her husband returned to Uruguay, in part to this idea of contributing to the new democracy. And they stayed there for about 4 years, and then ended up relocating to Austin, Texas, where he got a job as a professor. And that's kind of where our paths crossed. And while they were in Austin, she continued writing collections of poetry, translating, contributing to literary magazines, and stayed there until 2016 when her husband died. And then she moved back to Montevideo to be closer to her daughter. And at age 98, she's still writing, traveling, speaking. Right now she's in Spain. We're trying to convince her to come to Mexico City, but she has written over 14 collections of poetry, the last one last year. She's published a book of poetic prose called Eloise de Biobu, which was recently translated to English, a memoir called Shakespeare Palace, essays on plants and animals, over 30 translations from Italian, French, and Portuguese, numerous essays collected in a volume. And when she moved to Mexico, all of a sudden there was kind of a shift in the world's attention to her work, and there were larger presses beginning to publish and circulate her collections of poetry. So she began being published by presses like Monteal, Avila in Caracas, the Fondo de Cultura Económica in Mexico, Paidós in Argentina, Tusquets in Spain. But really, the last 15 years have been quite remarkable. So she's now, again, she's almost 99. And there's been this boom of what she likes to joke, and her friends like to joke, like Ida mania, like the mania of Ida. And all of a sudden, she has just been reigned almost every literary prize and recognition that could be offered to somebody writing in Spanish. So the only one she hasn't really won is the Nobel Prize in Literature, but she's gotten just about everything else. And it's been in this quick succession in the last about 13 years. So in 2009, she got the Octavio Paz Prize for Poetry and Essay. In 2014, the Alfonso Reyes Prize. In 2015, the Queen Sofia Prize for Poetry. In 2016, Federico Garcia Lorca International Poetry Prize. In the 2017, the Max Jacob Prize. In 2018, the Cervantes Prize, which is basically the Spanish equivalent of the Nobel Prize in Literature. And she was recently named a commander of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French Ministry of Culture. So she has not stopped. I don't think she'll stop. I think she will die producing or presenting or something, but all of a sudden there's been this boom. And she kind of likes to joke that the reason why she's getting all of this recognition is because she's outlived all of her peers, right? That it's her longevity. But she really, truly is an extraordinary author. And I say that after having spent long periods of time with her personally, and as well as spending a lot of time with her work. And I would just kind of summarize her uniqueness just as a poet and a person. She just has this limitless energy and curiosity about the world that surrounds her. And her work kind of springs from this really direct, lucid perception of life. It's funny, you go walking with her and she'll see a bird and she'll know the species of the bird and watch the bird and tell you the story of the bird. And there's just, there's this observation and attention to the here and now, but also to works of art, to experience of time, of mortality, to the process of literary creation. And unlike maybe some of her peers, she never really clung on to an ideological bent. There's this very open questioning of the world. There are very few answers in her poetry. There's a lot of questioning, of doubt, of pausing, no easy answers, but this kind of delving into what it means to be human, what it means to be alive, I think is something that she's sustained since she began publishing till today. So that was a long answer, Novia, I'm sorry.
No, I love it because, of course, so Sarah and I know each other from being at the University of Texas, where I did my master's and she did her PhD. And so I knew of Ida, but I didn't know her obviously the way you do. And so it's wonderful to hear more about her life and what an incredible life it has been, right? And it continues to be. So just I want to read another poem, but before we go to that, I'm wondering what you think, like how has translation of her work, it seems like translation of her work has been more recent, maybe in these last like 15 years or so. How do you think, how do you think it has contributed to the Ida mania? I love that.
I think translation in the United States is always sometimes a couple steps behind maybe translation in Europe. So the very first, there have been significant anthologies of her work published in Brazilian Portuguese, in French, and in Italian. So really significant long anthologies that are quite representative of all of her work. In English, I was the first one to translate a whole volume of poetry by her, which was actually not that long. I have the book here. It's a very slim volume, you can see. It was by an independent press, Post Publications, and it was a project that she and I came up with together. It was not because there was a big press saying, we now have to translate Ida, because no, it was something much more organic than that. After I did that translation, there was a an anthology of poetry translated by Kathleen Hedin and Victor Nunez, who also spent some time in Austin. And they published an anthology, kind of a medium-sized anthology with SALT Publications in the UK. But now that she has won all these prizes, there is this recognition. I would definitely say that has influenced the decision, for example, of New Directions, which is a much more prominent publisher in the United States, to kind of commission this anthology that I'm working on now. So that definitely, there's been the synchronicity, but I would say without the prizes and without her getting all this press, that probably wouldn't happen. It's really hard to get bigger presses interested in poetry. There's just no money in it.
Yeah.
And so now that she has this kind of the economy of prestige, of the international prestige, it would look bad not to have a bigger volume of her work in recent translation. So yes.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. I always sort of lament, there's all these, I mean, she's been involved with she's a great writer, and she's been involved with all of these, you know, world-renowned writers as well, like Octavio Paz, Obama, like all these people, right? And the fact that it's like she has to win prizes for this work to be valued in English, you know, to be translated and valued in English, you know, is too bad. But it's so great that there is this opportunity, right, to bring it to audiences who want the English and the Spanish together. So.
Mm-hmm. I should also mention that Sean Manning, who is also a graduate of UT, recently published her prose work, her kind of poetic prose. In Spanish, it's called ABC de Biobu, and in English, it's now just titled Biobu, just the name of the character. So that recently came out. But again, I think it's a reflection of her accumulation of this symbolic capital that allowed these publications to be possible.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that you say is, I have a copy of Reason Enough here, but one of the things that you say in the introduction to this that sort of stuck out to me was the spareness. So like that her poetry is very spare in a lot of ways, and a lot of the poems. So I want to, there's a couple of here that I think that you sent me that I think represent that, right, and that illustrate that. And one that's sort of connected to what you were saying about her and who she is and how she sort of comes to be a writer and how she, you know, lives her life, is the poem Fortune or Fortuna. So I wonder if we could read that, and I wonder if maybe I'll read the English and you will read the Spanish this time. Would that work for you? Okay. Okay, so this is from the collection Trema, right, from 2005. Okay. For years to relish errors and their amends, able to speak, walk freely, not endure mutilation, not enter churches, or enter, read, listen to beloved music, by a being by night as well as by day. To not be married off in a transaction valued in goats, to not suffer the dominion of relatives, or legal lapidation, to not march ever again or allow words that inject iron filings in your blood. To discover for yourself another unforeseen being on the bridge of a gaze. To be human and woman, no more, no less.
Thank you, Novia. Okay, Fortuna. Por años, disfrutar del error y de su enmienda. Haber podido hablar, caminar libre, no existir mutilada, no entrar, o sí, en iglesias, leer, oír la música querida, ser en la noche un ser como en el día. No ser casada en un negocio, medida en cabras, sufrir gobierno de parientes o legal lapidación. No desfilar ya nunca, y no admitir palabras que pongan en la sangre limaduras de hierro. Descubrir por ti misma otro ser no previsto en el puente de la mirada. Ser humano y mujer, ni más ni menos.
Thank you. Oh. This poem almost seems like a manifestación, like a sort of a line in the sand, right? A little bit. Can you talk a little bit about, if you remember translating this poem in particular, but sort of how you approach your translations and how you maybe approach this poem?
This one is one of her kind of canonical poems, and there have been a couple different versions and translations of it before. So I tried, first of all, not to read co-translators, because there's a beauty in comparing, but also to just read and try to get one's own sense of something. So in this poem, I think you're absolutely right, Novia, that it is a line in the sand. The last verse is actually separate from the rest of the poem, ser humano y mujer ni más ni menos, right? To be human and woman, no more, no less. And that's its own it's its own separate, there's another verse there, it's just by itself. So that does seem like literally a line. It's a verse of poetry, also a line, yeah. And you're absolutely right. Yeah. And there is an economy of words. So in Spanish, one of the challenges, I think, with some of the poems that she writes is the use of the words of verbs and infinitive. So if you'd like, I can share. Do you want me to share my screen?
Sure. I think it really helps to look at poetry, right? Because it also has a certain structure that. Let me make you a co-host so that you can share. Okay, you should be able to share.
All right, let's see. So if you look at the poem in the original, there are lots of verbs in infinitive: disfrutar, haber, existir, entrar, leer, oír, ser, no, and it continues all the way down. And so one of the questions was how to deal with that, and how to, if it's just best to do the two, or to change this into the gerund into an ing, right? So there could be the option of, for years, in relishing or enjoying versus to relish or to enjoy, right? And so one of the choices had to be how to figure out how to use these verbs all the way through. And so I ended up choosing just the simple infinitive, right? For years, to relish, to speak, but then sometimes changing into the gerund form, being, right? There's also this issue of the word ser in Spanish is a verb, but it also means, so it's like the word being in English, right? So a human being versus the verb to be. So these are all things that I had to consider. And as I was saying before, there is this economy in language. And in English, in general, English is a little bit less wordy than Spanish for the most part. But there are some things that Spanish can do, like leaving off the subject pronouns, right? Going straight to a verb. So I just think that each poem, I start with rereading it, making sure I understand what I think all the vocabulary is, the structure of the poem, then listening to the rhythms of it and trying to put that into the English in a certain equivalent way. So if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I translated that one, but I remember the verbs being particularly just trying to figure out how to deal with that the best. And
well, that's,
go ahead.
No, I was going to ask it. So that's so interesting as I'm looking at it again here, right? I see the ser humano, which could be human being, or to be human.
Yes.
right? And so making that choice that was to be human and woman rather than human being and woman, which would have a different connotation, I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So should we go on to another poem or question?
Yeah, let's go on to another poem, and then maybe we can take some. I have lots of questions, but I'd love to hear questions from everybody who's here. So is there one that you really want to read, Sarah, that is one of your favorites of the list that you gave? Well, I can pick one too, but I wanted to leave it open for you to pick.
I'm gonna just let you choose. There are a couple of things, it depends what we want to speak about. The poem Unicorn was my attempt at translating a sonnet, which is tricky. The poem Calecita is a very interesting poetic exercise, but I love all of them. So if there's something that you would like to read with me, that would be wonderful. Let me know.
So Calecita, I've read through all of these and I was like, ooh, reading each one like, oh, this one is so great, or this one. But Calecita really grabbed my attention because I really like that kind of wordplay and the rhythm of it. Mm-hmm. So maybe we could read that one.
Do you want the English or the Spanish? Which one would you prefer?
I don't, no preference, whichever you
would
like.
I'll do my English and then you can do the Spanish.
Okay,
so
sounds good.
Merry-go-round. The carousel, the roundabout, the what do you call it, the merry-go-round, it called to me, a candle flame with a stag, a coach, a swan, and a horse, a rearing horse, a marvel that circles around so still it trotted up through the air with organ pipes and little bells, the air not moving the horse's tail, so golden and white but dangerous, the danger of falling off in mid-flight, of falling and being forgotten by father, of getting off elsewhere than where I got on, all at once alone without clouds or wind now in my hair. I am lost without the delectable fear of flying with hands both clutching the mane, now loosening my grasp, and I am clay in the kiln of air that slowly recovers its stillness of form, the form of beginnings of being alone without wings.
All right, I'm going to give it my best shot to follow that rhythm. Calecita. El carrusel, el tío vivo, el cómo se llamaba, la calecita. Llama que me ofrecía un ciervo, una caleza, un cisne y un caballo encabritado. El prodigio que giraba tan quieto que tan quieto trotaba por un aire con organillo y campanillas, aire que no movía la cola del caballo dorado y blanco, pero de peligro de caerme en pleno vuelo, de caerme y quedar así olvidada del padre, de bajar en otro punto del punto de su vida y verme sola, sin nube, sin ya viento en el pelo, perdida sin el miedo delicioso de volar con las manos aferradas a crines que me sueltan y yo arcilla que en el horno del aire recupera su forma quieta, forma del principio de ser sola y sin alas.
Yay, thank you.
Yeah, I just love that image of the merry-go-round, right? I think we can all relate to that, being children or taking children, and the it sort of like goes faster and faster and faster, right? And then it's like this quiet and more serious, it takes a more serious tone as well, right?
Yes.
And not slowing down. Yeah, that's wonderful. I think I saw that there were a couple of questions in the chat here. Oh yeah, Ellie says it's samba-ish, right? Like Waters of March, playful. Absolutely. So Stacy's asking, how long does the translation process normally take? And this is very interested to hear about what you have to think about when doing that work.
So that's a tough question. The translation process can be infinite. And even when I was sending Novia the selection of poems, I'd already turned it in a couple of days earlier to the press. And I was reading again Calecita, the translation in English. I thought, oh gosh, wait a second, I don't like this syllable, and I tweaked it again, and now I have to. It's something that I think it's as long as you let it be. And it's a good thing that there are deadlines, because otherwise I think one can always be rewriting. And I guess my comfort comes from there's a really good story called Pierre Menard, autor del Quijote, or Pierre Menard, the author of the Quixote by Jorge Luis Borges, which talks about how texts gain in complexity and in context and are rewritten through the ages as things happen, as circumstances change, as life passes. And so I guess my comfort is that regardless of what I end up doing in the translation process, there's always going to be a new version, and the new version can be through the reading, the new version can be somebody else's translation. So I think the process itself is never over. To be a little bit more concrete and practical, so I was given this project about a year ago, and the parameters for it were somewhat fluid because we didn't know who was going to be publishing it and what exactly they were looking for. And so I started translating so I would have a sample of poems to be able to hand to the press, right? And then the guidelines were put into place, and even they have been shifting. So the process of translation, it can take a long time, especially for poetry, and I might be a slower person, a slower translator, but I really like to understand systems. And so it takes a lot of reading first. For me, it means really understanding the poem itself, the poem within the context of the work. And for a poem like this, as Novia was really astutely observing, a lot of it has to do with that rhythm. And as one of the commentators said, you know, there's a samba-like feeling, or this swirling round and round, and this velocity. And so first of all, it's kind of understanding that, hearing it in Spanish, thinking how the words and the rhythms all work in English, and revising it and revising it and revising it again. So it can be an endless process. It has to, you know, at some point you just have to say, go out into the world. But I think, especially for poetry, I take a lot longer. For prose, I'm a lot faster. It's a different type of work, a different type of process for me. But I think because each poem is autonomous, it should be able to stand by itself. Each poem has its own internal rules, it has its own rhythm, it has its own voice. And in a collection of poetry, you can see kind of this wide richness in different approaches, different poetic forms, different games. So each is rather like a rompecabezas, like a jigsaw puzzle that you have to begin figuring out how all the parts work together, and what works in one poem doesn't necessarily work in the next one, even though there are certain systems and vocabulary and tropes that are repeated, and then you have to know how much to repeat and how much is by chance. So that's a very convoluted answer to say it takes a while.
Definitely, that constant editing, you know, being able to let go of it, that's a skill, I think. Right. So Jelena, you have a question, please go ahead.
Yes, this is all so fascinating. I have like 10 million questions, but I won't ask them. I'll just ask one. So thank you for sharing this. One question that I have is how much, so I was thinking of the word like caminar, right? Caminar, is it to walk or walking, right? And how much of yourself goes in the translation, like your own creativity, your own subjectivity, because you have choices to make, right? And as you say, it's like a rompecabezas, you're putting these puzzles together. Do you prioritize like the verse, the structure, the feeling, the emotion? And so how much of you goes into that? And the second part of the question is how much, you mentioned doing research and doing the reading, like how much of Uruguay do you research, right? Because when I was hearing you read the poem, I was like, oh, I was listening to it with Uruguayan accent. I lived in Uruguay when I was little. So everything that you mentioned about the public education and just like the context matters, right? So how much research, like did you, I don't know if you traveled to Uruguay, but like how much of research on the context, not just of her life, but of where she grew up also, how much of that goes into the translation process?
Wonderful questions. Thank you, Jelena. I appreciate that. So the first one about me, I think for a long time, the ideal of what the translator should be is what there's a very famous critic named Lawrence Venuti, who criticized this prevalent idea of the translator's invisibility, that the translator should be almost non-existent, that you should be trying to transpose, to carry into the other language a text, and the translator herself really should disappear from that process. And so much so that for many, many years, it was often quite common for the translator's name never to appear on the text, in the text itself. And fortunately, at least my way of seeing things, is that there's a greater recognition that that ideal probably should not, it should not be the ideal for what our work is for this craft. And I would argue for what has been called like an embodied translation, which means a recognition of oneself as a human being who is living particular circumstances, that is reading particular texts at a particular moment, that has a certain understanding, that is experiencing joy and sadness and all the human emotions, and is a person who's doing an act of reading and writing that is the closest, most proximate that you can to another person's work, but that the idea of disappearing myself is, at least in my opinion, is not the ideal. It's not the goal anymore. And my creativity is a major part in doing this translation. And my creativity is going to be different than your creativity. And my solution is going to be different than your solution. And I don't want to make a hierarchy of creativities and solutions, but if the text is, the text is offering this richness, and I'm part of it. And so I don't want to disappear myself. And I know that some of the things that I'm reading and listening to automatically go into my translation. So if you listen to that last poem, there's a lot of alliteration, there's a lot of wordplay. And it happened to be that I, embarrassingly, had never read Moby Dick before. One of these big holes in my reading, I'd never read Moby Dick. And so I started listening to it on Audible. And the reader is fabulous. I highly recommend. I don't know the reader's name, I should, but just this brilliant reader. And Melville is so full of alliteration and this richness in vocabulary. And I know that my soaking in that, listening to it at night or while I'm doing the dishes or vacuuming the floor, I know that somehow crept into my word choices, and that's good and fine and natural. And that's me and my lived experience now. And in a year, I'll be reading something else, and my influences will be other, and my choices will be different too. And I go back and look at some of my previous translations of Ida's work. And yes, I would do things differently, and that's okay. And I don't know if I would necessarily call it better or worse. They're just different choices. And so I think I've reconciled to the fact that there's never going to be a definitive translation. There are not. And they're just like, there's never going to be a definitive text. The text exists. My understanding of it is going to be different than yours, than Ellie's, than Maddie's, et cetera. And that's part of the beauty and this infinite possibility of the word. And so I would say mine is an embodied translation, and that's fine. And it's a reflection of me and my creativity too. And it will be of somebody else's when they try their hand at the same task. With regard to your second question, there's a lot of research that goes into this. I don't know if necessarily kind of biographical research, although I think it's important to know where a writer comes from and their readings, but Ida is highly cultured. I mean, to this extreme degree that I sometimes want to hide in a closet and say, I know nothing, which is how she often makes me feel about music, about painting, about history, about etymology, about there's so much. And some days my reaction is, God, I know nothing, and what am I doing? And other days this is this amazing encyclopedia of jewels of culture that I am eating up. And so I do a lot of research, and I am so grateful to be a translator today, because there are so many resources readily at my disposition, and that when I began was not so easy. It would have taken a whole library, and given that I'm in Mexico City in a pandemic, researching all these things and finding the right books, it would take so much longer. So the good thing is, if I need to figure out who Pantenir is, and it's, one of the first landscape painters who also had a lot of themes that were both Christian but also mythologically based, and one of the poems is based on an interpretation of this poem. I can look at the cuadro, at the painting. I can read interpretations of the cuadro. I can get a close-up of it. I don't have to go to the museum, and I don't know if it's in London where the painting is, so fortunately that research is a lot easier today, but it does take a lot of sleuthing, and it's something that most of the time I really enjoy and feel enriched by.
So I want to get to another poem, but that makes me, thank you for that. It's so interesting to think about the process, and then your own subjectivity, right, in the poems. But I'm thinking about how much back and forth or contact do you have with the author, right? I mean, you know Ida very well. I don't know if that's the case with the other authors that you've translated, but how much access do you have to say, I'm looking at this line and I'm thinking this, but can you confirm? Or
that's a great question. The experience has really been different depending on the various projects. So I translated a book by Mexican author Silvia Eugenia Castillero, Eloise, and that project was commissioned, so it was something that I was asked to translate, and I don't know Silvia personally. And my understanding from her was that her English was not strong enough to be able to feel like she could comment with authority on my translation. And so she preferred that I finish the translation and write her any specific questions that I might have, but she didn't really want to mess around with any of my work. She answered the questions and we were done. So that was one of the very shortest interactions I've had. With some authors, the process has been very long and sustained, and it's been an interesting and often very joyful conversation. So I approached an author, Alain-Paul Mallard, who's also Mexican. He's the author of a novella that's very lyrical, philosophical, this kind of unusual jewel of a text. And I loved it in Spanish and asked him if I could translate it into English. It had already been translated into French, I think Italian, I don't remember what else by then. And he said yes, and I didn't know him either, but he's very, very careful craftsman, as much as any poet that I've worked with. And we had this meticulous, detailed conversation. I did not know him personally at that time, and it was all through writing. So there was this epistolary friendship that developed through email, and I would send him my translation with all sorts of questions in the margin. Then he would come back in a different color and write his suggestions, and we would debate. And I don't know, I should look at my archive to see, just how many different versions we sent back and forth. And he really was looking for a very specific tone, this economy of language, a particular register that he had crafted. He started writing a book that was probably 300 pages long, and then cut and cut and cut and cut and cut and cut and cut until it was this really very small, 50-page book. So he was very particular about his language. And so we negotiated and talked and debated, and it was this very hands-on process. which was probably the most contact I've had with an author regarding my word choice. And it was exciting, and it developed into this great literary and intellectual friendship. And then I finally met him in person, but it felt like we'd known each other forever because we'd had this exchange. With Ida, she's now almost 99. She does use her email. She's a little bit hard of hearing, so talking over the phone is somewhat difficult, but her daughter Amparo, who lives just about a block away from her, is her right-hand woman at the moment. And so if I have particular questions, I relay them through email to Amparo, and she talks them over, then Amparo writes whatever Ida says, and then I make my judgment. Ida's English is not nearly as strong as her French, Italian, or Portuguese, so she's never meddled with my translation, but she's really been very helpful in making specific word choices. I think part of the issue with translating Ida, I mean, there are a bunch of them actually, is that her syntax can be very complicated. So instead of, in English, a subject, verb, predicate, it's a lot more complicated, and often the verb comes first and the subject's a bunch of lines below. And so sometimes there are some ambivalences in terms of who's doing what. She also favors a lot of word choices that have multiple meanings. And so sometimes when I'm sitting there with the dictionary and thinking of a particular word, and in English, we don't have the same polysemy of multiple meanings for that same word in English, then I'll sometimes write her an email and say, okay, the word copa can mean the top of a tree, but it can also mean a glass, right? And in this particular poem, we're talking about jugos and copas súbitos. So they're juices in these sudden copas. And so is the copa, because the poem is marzo, and in Uruguay, marzo is actually the beginning of the fall because it's the opposite seasons of the northern hemisphere. And so she's talking about the changing colors of leaves. And so is it better to use copa as actually like a wine glass that you toast with, or are we actually favoring the meaning of the copa de un árbol, which is the top of a tree? And so it's that type of thing where she can say, hey, I don't know, you choose, or I was much more thinking about this meaning, I privilege this over that, and then I make my own decision. So it really depends on the author and very case by case.
Thank you for that. That's it sounds like it could be a really fun exchange, right? Because you really get into the nuances of the language, right? Going back and forth. So that maybe some people wouldn't find that fun, but that sounds like a blast to me. So we have like about 10 or so minutes remaining. So I'd like to get to at least one more poem, and the two that I was, there's three that I was sort of choosing between, the abuelo, grandfather, this world, este mundo, and unicorn, the unicornio. And you mentioned that since unicorn is a sonnet, it makes it a little bit different than some of the other poems. So I wonder if we could do that one and talk a little bit about what it means that it's a sonnet and how you approach that. So let's maybe read the poem first. Look, maybe if you want to read the English and I'll do the Spanish again.
Okay.
Should
I start? Okay. All right. Yeah. Unicorn. The narwhal has the glory of his horn, incomparable in size, spiraled in shape, and the discomfort of suspecting himself strange, not knowing if he's heaven or earth-born. Ivory and a charming ruse adorn this spot of the museum in winter shades. But having forged his legend through the ages, dawn white shines the eternal unicorn. The narwhal swims in waters that are true, and no one even thinks about his fate. Meanwhile, in waters that our dreams construe, the unicorn, more firm and millenary, light's paladin against death awaits, unconquerable by the real, the imaginary.
Okay, and now the Spanish. Unicornio. Tiene el narval la gloria de su cuerno, torneada forma, insólito tamaño, y la inquietud de sospecharse extraño, sin saberse del cielo o del infierno. Marfil en el rincón, color invierno, en el museo erige hermoso engaño, fraguando su leyenda año tras año, mientras albea el unicornio eterno. Va el narval por el agua verdadera, sin que nadie se ocupe de su suerte, mientras en aguas, thank you, Sarah, for putting this up. En aguas del soñar espera, más firme, el unicornio milenario, paladín de la luz contra la muerte, invicto ante lo real, lo imaginario.
Thank you, Novia. I'm sorry for startling you with.
No, that's great. That's great. It's helpful to see it.
So if this is a question that is hard to answer, and I fortunately didn't have to deal with it too often. Ida does write sonnets, and in Spanish, the sonnet, if you look at this, it has this A. If we talk about rhymes, we usually put letters at the endings of verses to indicate their rhyme scheme. So if we look at this cuerno and infierno rhyme, and so if we look at this as well, tamaño and extraño are an exact rhyme. Over here, invierno, eterno, also rhyme, right? And engaño and año rhyme. And then we have over here, verdadera y espera, suerte, muerte, milenario, imaginario. So that's one of the common features of a sonnet, is this particular rhyme scheme. The second is that each verse in this particular sonnet is 11 syllables. So we have tiene el narval la gloria de su cuerno. There are 11 syllables per verse. And so the question is, what strictures does one as a translator want to self-impose? So there's some people who take a sonnet and just say, we're throwing the rhyme out the window and we're going really for meaning, or we're going mostly for rhythm, or we're trying to do a little bit of all of that. And because the number of rhyming poems that I chose to translate for this volume were fewer in number, if there had been most of them, then maybe they would have needed a different translator. Because it's a real challenge to not only have to figure out the meaning, but also then if one is going to self-impose particular rhyming and metric schemes on top of that. So I did try to honor that particular important formal element of this poem. And so I then had to figure out rhymes that would work. This meant sometimes rearranging a little bit the order of the verses, still keeping the most of the exact same meaning, a lot of the lexical choices, the word choices, but being able to construct a similar rhyme scheme. So if you look at mine, here's horn and born. The rhymes are not always 100% exact. We have shape and strange. They're similar in sound. The long A and the P and the G are very similar, but they're not an exact rhyme, right? Adorn, unicorn, so this is an exact rhyme. The shades, the shape, the strange, and ages, they all are a close family in sound, right? And if you think of a lot of more contemporary rhyming songs, right? Even if you think pop songs, Olivia Rodrigo or something like that, right? So very contemporary singers are now kind of eschewing the exact rhyme for these more similar families of sounds. So this is a liberty I gave myself, is not having the exact consonants, but the vowel sounds and similar consonant sounds. And over here, right, true, construe, fate, awaits, millenary, imaginary. And in English, we don't do metrics the same way that we do in Spanish. So Spanish, the way that you count syllables is very different. the idea of meter in Spanish is kind of the number, the count of syllables, and also the stronger syllables versus weak ones. So if we take this verse, tiene el narval la gloria de su cuerno, in Spanish, if you have a vowel at the end of a word and a vowel at the beginning of the next word, those two words kind of are joined together in syllable count. So when you pronounce it, because they're both this A sound, tiene el narval, the el and the tiene kind of get joined together into one count of the syllable. So it's a very different way of counting metrics. And in English, the most common meter for a sonnet is iambic pentameter, which is da-dun, 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 da-dun. And so that is because it's what's used in English sonnets. That was what I tried to imitate more than trying to keep an arbitrary 11 syllable count per verse. So there are a number of different factors that go into this type of translation. It takes a long time. Going back to the question I had, this one took a lot of tinkering and more tinkering and trying to understand. And also it needed to read naturally. So you'll be the judge of that if it worked or didn't work. But those are some of the considerations of translating a rhymed and metered poetry.
Thank you for that. It seems so intricate. I mean, I know sonnets are, you know, when I think of sonnets, of course, I think of Shakespeare and the iambic pentameter. So to be able to translate that and have those rhymes work out, that's incredible. So I want to end with a poem, but I want to see if there are any other questions from the folks here before we. I'd like, if you agree, Sarah, I'd like to end with This World.
Sure.
Any questions from anyone here? Any of our students or faculty or staff? Okay. Well, maybe we can end with this poem and then we'll close after. I've actually asked Jelena if she would read the Spanish this time. And so Sarah, I'll ask you to start with the English.
Okay, this is This World. I only accept this illuminated world, true, inconstant, mine. I only exalt its eternal labyrinth and its certain light, even if it hides. Awake or in slumber, I tread this grave land and its patience within me blooms. It has a soundless circle, a limbo perhaps, where I blindly await rain or fire unchained. Sometimes its light changes and it's an inferno. Sometimes, rarely, a paradise. Maybe someone could crack open doors, see beyond promises, successions. I only dwell within it, await it, and that's wonder enough. In it I am, may I remain, be reborn.
Thank you.
I
think for the Spanish, perdón, sorry. I was gonna say for the Spanish, I think I'm gonna follow Sarah's practice here and put it up on the screen for people to see. Go ahead, Jelena.
Este mundo. Solo acepto este mundo iluminado, cierto, inconstante, mío. Solo exalto su eterno laberinto y su segura luz, aunque se esconda. Despierta o entre sueños su grave tierra piso y es su paciencia en mí la que florece. Tiene un círculo sordo, limbo acaso, donde a ciegas aguardo la lluvia, el fuego desencadenados. A veces su luz cambia, es el infierno. A veces, rara vez, el paraíso. Alguien podrá quizás entreabrir puertas, ver más allá promesas, sucesiones. Yo solo en él habito, de él espero, y hay suficiente asombro. En él estoy, me quedé, renaciera. Me quede or me quede. Me quede.
Yeah.
Me quede. I was like, oh, I read it wrong. Me quede.
Thank you so
It's not
much.
commonly used.
Well, I wanted to end with this poem because I again feel like even though it's from 1960, is that right, Sarah?
Yeah.
It really still encapsulates, right, the world and how one might feel in it these days. So I wanted to thank you for sharing it with us. And thank you so much for being here. This has been such a lovely way to end this Wednesday and to have this little break in the middle of the week, especially at this time in the semester.
Thank you, Novia. I really appreciate it. And it's been wonderful to share this time with you and to talk about poetry, which I think we need to do more of in general.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Well, have a good evening, everybody. Sarah, thank you again.
Thank
have a
you so much.
good night.
I
Okay.
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
everyone.
Everybody.
Everyone.
Wonderful. Ciao,
Okay.
ciao.
Bye.